Welcome to the Jack Westin MCAT podcast with your host, Phil Hawkins.
And Azaii Calderon Muñiz.
The question everyone is actually asking themselves, how do I get into medical school? So a lot of our podcast really focuses on the MCAT itself. We talk a lot about content. We talk about how to study. We had that whole section on how to study actively and efficiently. But really the bulk of what we do is, yes, to help you get a fantastic MCAT score, but also to help you get into medical school. And that's why, for example, I know we were just talking with our admissions person to make sure that we were being consistent and that we all kind of were on the same page. But that's really what we're here for, to help you succeed into getting into medical school. And so that's kind of the theme of today's podcast, which I'm personally super excited about. I know physics is your jam, Phil. This is what I love, in addition to cars. But that's, there are things that you can do even now in undergrad, in addition to preparing for the MCAT, because at the end of the day, the MCAT is just one part of the application that you are submitting to medical schools. And it's just one part of what will get you into medical school. And so what we're going to be talking about is a little bit more granular, but also more general in the sense that you're going to want to think about where you want to go. A lot of students, they kind of come into this and they say, okay, I just want to get into medical school. And that's great. But at the end of the day, you want to go somewhere where you are going to be supported, where you are going to be the best version of a physician that you can be, and that's a right fit for you. And so understanding kind of where at least you're going to consider going, maybe it's based on geography, maybe it's based on some of the things we're going to be talking about later. Maybe, you have a particular place you've always had in mind and always dreamed of going to. Write those things down and consider them as we talk through some of the more granular things that you can do now to help you get into medical school.
Yeah, to just kind of I always like to kind of take a step back sometimes. The reason we're doing this is because we have a lot of students that come to us obviously for MCAT stuff, and there's a lot of stuff we do with MCAT. But then over the course of a conversation, it becomes obvious that they are neglecting other parts that are involved in getting into med school. And so we just wanted to kind of take a minute and kind of talk about other things you should be doing and should be thinking about in undergrad in order to help you get into med school. So we're not going to talk about the MCAT today, despite this being an MCAT podcast. But obviously the MCAT is a part of this, but it's very common and very often that students get so tunnel visioned on the MCAT that they kind of neglect all of these other things. Some of these are things that I think are important for even freshmen to be paying attention to sophomores, which kind of brings us to the first thing is your GPA. You need to keep it up. You want to have a higher GPA. I'm not saying that you can't get in with a low GPA, especially there's a lot of students that kind of struggled their freshman year and their GPA was a little bit lower, but they were able to kind of pull it together later on. I think that that's fine. And that can work. It does make it a little bit harder than if it was, just great and phenomenal GPA the whole time. But the process of getting into med school is a hard process. And so while it may be possible to do things in a way that sometimes makes it harder, we want to make this easier if you can. I want students to not just be able to get into med schools, but to be able to be choosy about what med schools they go to, right? That's the ultimate goal. It's not just to get students accepted to med schools, but let students be which med school do I want to go to? And that's kind of a big deal. And you got to keep your GPA up. And I know that sounds obvious and everyone knows this, but be aware it's not just science stuff. And I realize this, I am not the perfect example of this because my freshman year, I got a bad grade in a yoga class that I was taking for credit and a theater class because I just I wasn't really that interested in yoga or theater, but we needed a physical ed requirement to graduate and yoga counted. And in one of the days, we were supposed to be just meditating and I just fell asleep. And And like the bell, like, they went off and class ended and I was just like sleeping on the floor and everyone just left. And I'm like, I think my teacher was annoyed by that. But this is something that that kind of bit me a little bit and made my process a little bit more difficult. I was kicking myself, like, why did I take yoga that semester? And why did I take, like, the yoga thing was so early in the morning. It was like 7:00 in the morning. And I'm like struggling. And it just wasn't important to me because yoga didn't seem that important and theater didn't seem that important. But in hindsight, while the classes themselves may not have been very, like, incredibly important for my journey, the grades were. And you want to keep an eye on those things, plan ahead, try to understand if you are going to have a harder semester, like, make sure that you are doing things to make it so that you can still be successful. I know I said we weren't going to talk about the MCAT, but don't, like, schedule your life so that your hardest semester is your semester that you're studying for the MCAT. That's also another mistake I made. And that made my life a whole lot harder than it needed to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And I couldn't agree more. I wish I had taken I wish our school had offered a yoga class. I would have been all over that because I needed to learn to zen and relax. But yeah, I think there are a couple of things there that you mentioned that I really want to highlight. The first is life happens, right? And we recognize that, and med schools recognize that. And so at the beginning, you might have had either a rough start, or you might have had a period where while you were in undergrad, you experienced some difficult life events. And so, yes, some medical schools will have GPA cutoffs that they use for screening. Not everyone will. And if you can manage to keep your GPA above those screening cutoffs, what's really, I think, great about a lot of medical schools that they've started pushing towards holistic or more overview person-centered applications is that, like you said, they're going to look at the progression of your GPA and not just, okay, they had this, they failed yoga class, and so we can't have them here, right? But did their scores and their grades improve with time? Maybe they really struggled with the transition to from high school to undergrad. So was there progression? Was there improvement? Or was it just kind of bad all the time? Those are two very different scenarios. There's also a lot of medical schools will give you the opportunity, is there anything else you'd like us to know? And this can be an opportunity. You should not be talking about this in your personal statement, perhaps, but it's an opportunity to let them know, hey, I had XYZ happen during this time. And so you might notice that my grades may have dipped, but you'll also notice the progression, et cetera. So giving some context is acceptable when you're considering how you're going to have that conversation with medical schools if your GPA is at a point where that's necessary. And so keeping it up is important. Something else that similar to what you've been talking about, Phil, is take classes that you like. Because at the end of the day, if you're sitting through a class and you're not motivated, you're not going to do as well. And so it's really easy to be like, I'm going to take that class because it's easy. But it might not actually be that easy. And if you're more invested, right, you're more likely to do better, and your professors will notice that. And I think that's something that is really easy to forget as well. I was a romance. I realized that I always say Spanish language, literature, and culture major, but it actually was romance languages, and I did more than just Spanish. Now that I think back, but one of my I took a couple of courses that I really loved, and I may not have gotten an A in them, but I cared about them and I got a higher score than if I had taken just something not related to what I really enjoyed. And like you said, it's not just the sciences. They ask for your overall GPA and then broken up, science and not science. And both of those get looked at. So really important for all of that for you to keep in mind as you're going through, and hopefully you will learn from our mistakes, our intent in improving, because at the end of the day, that's why we share these experiences. I don't know about you, Phil, but this isn't a place, it would feel awkward if it was just us talking about ourselves all the time.
Yes.
Right. For the sake, because that would be so just ill.
Self-centered, I feel like, at least for me.
But, we have this experience, and I wish that people would have told me. And sometimes I wish I would have listened, because there were times where I had people tell me things and I just didn't listen. So sometimes you got to learn some life lessons on your own. But if you can learn from somebody else's mistakes, even better.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And I think you're right. Taking stuff that you are happy about. I think a lot of students look up like, oh, what major will make it easiest for me to get into med school? And like, that is not how you want to do it. Pick something that you're actually interested in. I went to med school with somebody who had a degree in performance piano. And so like he was in the music college, and yeah, like now he's a surgeon. Like he's really good with his hands. Like he's so like hand coordinated. And I also went to school. I know I've talked about this. My friend Joe has a degree in evolutionary linguistics, and he just studied like how language changed over time. And that's just something he's interested in. Kind of on the like more personal side of things, like I really, instead of that yoga class, I wanted to take, they had a wilderness survival class that had like at the end of the semester, your final was you go camping. And I'm like, yeah, that sounds like the funnest course, but that one filled up really fast. And so I'm like, I'll just take yoga. It'll be easy. I wasn't taking the one that I thought was interesting. I was taking the one that I thought would be easy. And then it ended up not being easy. But yeah.
And I know we weren't planning on talking about this, but you said it and I can't let it go. Majors, do what you care about, because at the end of the day, you're not going to have that opportunity again. I went in thinking I was going to be a biochem major. No, very quickly realized that was not going to happen. But it might be the last chance you get to sit down and just enjoy what you really enjoy in terms of an academic setting that is going to be tougher once you're in medical school, right? It's going to be tougher once you're a physician. Going back and, getting a whole nother degree in music would have been really tough it would be tough if you're a surgeon, right? Not exactly the easiest thing to do. And so keep that in mind when you're deciding your majors. And I know that this applies more for people who are earlier on in college, but if you're listening to us and you are earlier on, that's something important to keep in mind. Also, minors. I know towards the end of their college years, some people are like, oh, I'm going to add this minor. And I thought I was going to minor in biology. I ended up having to finish undergrad a little earlier for personal reasons. But I was like, would I have enjoyed that as much as taking that extra, literature and culture class? Probably not as much, honestly, because I knew I was going to get plenty of bio while, in medical school and beyond. And so it was kind of that last opportunity. And I think that's also worth considering while you're deciding where else you can spend your extra time with the things that we're going to be talking about.
Yeah. I what's funny is you said that, and I actually went the opposite way. Like, don't be afraid to like take classes that you're not super, like, that don't make sense necessarily. I had to take a philosophy course as a part of my like prereqs. And so I took a philosophy course, but, for a little bit of context, I was a bad student in high school. I got to I wasn't even in the top half of my class. My high school had more welding classes than biology and chemistry and physics combined. I grew up in a very small farming community. And so there was not a lot of academic rigor. And so when I went to college, like my world kind of exploded. I'm like, oh my gosh, there's so much cool stuff to study and learn going through this. And so at one point I was a biology, chemistry, and physics triple major because I'm like, it's so interesting. I want to take these classes. And then at one point I took this physics course called Math Methods of Theoretical Physics. And I hated it because it was so like the whole class was like, okay, we can calculate this in in 3 dimensions. Now calculate it in 5. And I'm like, why? Right? Like, why do I need to know like what a pentagon, like the volume of a pentagon, irregular pentagon in a 7-dimensional space? And I'm like, what does that even mean? And so like the whole course, I got really sick of it because like literally me and everyone in the class, there's only 5 of us. We would all have to do our homework together because we had to use a supercomputer. So we had to like borrow time. And so like our homework was just all of us figuring out how to write out the equation, plugging it in, and then wait 2 hours for it to give us an answer. And then we turned in the answer. But I got really sick of it. And because I realize now that I'm much more practical. Like I want to understand how to build things and how to do stuff. I don't care about theoretical physics as much. But I took a philosophy course and I'm like, oh, like it was super interesting, like the philosophy course was. And so my last year, I decided, you know what? I only need one more class for my physics major. I'm dropping it. And I'm going to take a bunch of philosophy classes instead. And so I actually minored in physics and philosophy instead of getting a physics degree. And I had a lot of people ask about that when I was interviewing. It's like, hey, I noticed that you took a lot of philosophy courses. And so I kind of explained that like, I'm more interested in practical versus theoretical physics. And I was just interested in this. So I took like theories on ethics and legal philosophy and things like that. And it was super interesting, like what's right and wrong and what's the nature of that. It also didn't help, or it didn't hurt, that like 3 of the major philosophy teachers at my school had backgrounds in sciences. So like one had a degree in chemistry, one engineering, and one wrote stuff about ecology. Like that was his main field of study that he did research in and that sort of thing. And I'm like, okay, like these people kind of like had the right perspective. So I just got really interested and kind of fell into it. And so I actually think that helped me with a lot with my interviews, because I was able to talk about things that I found interesting, things that I found that I was passionate about. Not just that, like I was passionate about the philosophy side, but I'm like, I know what I liked about physics, and this was not it. And like talking about how I got kind of annoyed with the theoretical abstract stuff, and I didn't feel like I was making a difference in the real world or figuring out anything about how the real world works. I think made them more interested in talking to me. And that's something, I know we aren't talking about interviews yet. We're just kind of talking about GPA. Man, we have not moved very far. But this is something that I think, take classes that you're interested in. Do stuff that you're more interested in, because it makes you more interesting, right? And that is like, I know another person, this is somebody I actually worked with, but they had a degree in animation. And like that was their undergraduate degree, was in animation, and like they decided that they wanted to go to med school, and like it was super interesting talking to that person. So don't feel like you have to just kind of stick with the default thing. And I also realized that I think we might be preaching to this audience a little bit late, because I feel like most of the people listening to us are probably in their junior year or late sophomore, and they may not want to change things up that much.
And that is okay. And if your primary passion falls under the sciences, more power to you. Yeah, go for it. Absolutely. Lean into it. Kind of along the note of classes that you take and whatnot, keep your notes. This sounds so silly. And I know a lot of us, and I raised my hand because this was definitely me. After Orgo, all I wanted to do was just have a bonfire and burn my notes. A couple of us actually talked about having a bonfire after some of our classes and just burning all our notes. But the reality is, both when you're studying for the MCAT, and I know we said we weren't going to talk about this, but also when you get to medical school, some of those old notes might actually be helpful. So when you're getting ready to study for the MCAT, being able to review what you already learned, or what you at least partially learned, can be helpful. But also when you make your really solid review guides, because we talked about that in the past, you can keep those for medical school. So you might keep your physics, your orgo, your chemistry across the board. And then those beautiful biochem notes that you took while studying for the MCAT, you're going to see those topics again. And hopefully we have reminded you that you're going to see them at the start of med school. If you listen to some of our earlier podcasts, you will hear about how these, some of these topics came up in conversation with surgeons during my clinical year, and other physicians as well. And how even now, as I'm studying for another national exam, they keep coming up. And so some of these topics never fully go away. And so keeping those notes doesn't hurt. And now if you're someone like...
Especially like biochem and cell bio 100%. And gen chem and things like that.
Yeah. Biochem, don't lose them. If you're someone like me where you have a tendency to write them by hand and you don't want to have to deal with a stack, a ginormous stack, maybe pick the highest yield ones that you're going to keep, or take pictures of them and store them on a drive.
Yeah.
But they can definitely be helpful.
Yeah, they can be helpful. I know that you've been talking about how you're using a lot of the biochem stuff you had in the past, like right now, to help you kind of study. I also think this is something you should be doing like as you're in undergrad as well. Like if you take Bio 101 and Chem 101 your freshman year, keep those notes. Yes. They will help you study for the MCAT. It's honestly not a bad idea to review those notes. Like 3 months after the class ended, just remind yourself of kind of like what's going on with these, just kind of flip through them. I'm not saying you need to sit down in the library over the course of 20 hours over the weekend and like pound through that, but just make sure that you are keeping this stuff in mind, that sort of spaced repetition, which I know we talked about in a previous podcast, where if you keep seeing things, it will stick better. But if you're anything like me, I feel like I had to memorize my amino acids like 6 or 7 times. Like honestly, like a couple of times in undergrad and then for the MCAT and then a couple of times in med school. And honestly, it would have been easier if I just would have really learned them well the first time. And it's like, it's not until now that I work on the MCAT that I'm like, oh, I know my amino acids forwards and backwards and sideways, and I don't need to review or study that ever again for the rest of my life. But that's something that, because I studied it, crammed it, and then never looked at it again until all of a sudden a year later, they're like, oh, you need to know these. I'm like, crap, I don't remember them. If you could just make it so that you study it and then remember it long term, that's going to be better for you overall and remove some work for you, make your life a little bit easier. Another thing is there are some, I know we've talked a lot about classes that are useful and like focusing on interesting stuff. I think that there are some classes that are useful that everyone should take if you get a chance. Anatomy and physiology is probably the top of that list for me. I think that if you get a chance to take it before the MCAT, great. It will help you with the MCAT. It'll help you understand kind of like, what does the liver do? What does the pancreas do? What's going on with the pituitary? What's going on with glands overall? But even if you've already taken the MCAT, or you're taking the MCAT now and you're not in anatomy and physiology, and so you don't get a chance to do it before the MCAT, I would say it's still probably worth taking if you get a chance, because it will make med school much easier for you. It eases that transition. I did not take anatomy and physiology in med school or in undergrad, and I wish I would have. A lot of my classmates had taken it. And that first semester of med school was much easier for those students compared to me. I'm like, this is all brand new to me. I don't know what anterior versus inferior. I don't know what these things mean. And so I was just trying to figure out, what do the words mean, like the language, let alone trying to learn all the facts about what's going on. And so if you get a chance, I would highly recommend anatomy and physiology. Other classes like developmental biology, embryology, virology, immunology, neurology. Like if you get a chance to take any of those, I think it can be useful, but I would especially recommend taking anatomy and physiology if you get a chance.
Yeah, I also wish I would have had the opportunity to take it and that I would have taken it. I went into med school having a little bit more familiarity with some of those terms, but for the anatomy itself, non-existent. And I say this being aware of how it's going to come off. Harvard doesn't have the best reputation for teaching their students anatomy. And so that was actually one of the first things that when we went to our clinical year, they were like, yeah, we know you got to study it. We are aware of the situation. And I think if I would have gone in having taken an anatomy and physio class and had that background in anatomy, I could have gotten even more out of the basics that was provided to us. And so you never know what the medical school, what kind of education, anatomy and physiology the medical school you're going to go to will have. And so that's also something to keep in mind, because that's something I never would have guessed in a million years about my current education.
Yeah, that's also just anatomy and like med school pacing is so fast.
Yeah.
And so like if you are, a lot of med schools seem to, at least the med school I went to, they seem to kind of expect you to have a good background in anatomy and physiology. And so when they threw you in, if you did not have that, this was way harder. And I feel like a lot of med schools, at least from other med students I've talked to, have had kind of a similar thing where for some reason, it seems like they kind of expect students to have a good working knowledge of anatomy and physiology, even though it is not a prerequisite for the MCAT. I honestly feel like it should be. Like if I could change it and add a prereq, I know a lot of students are like, wait, why would he add more work for us? But like, honestly, I think it would make your lives easier if you took it before the MCAT and took it before you went to med school. I think that in the long run, you'd probably thank me. You'd probably be annoyed at me in undergrad. Like those of you who are listening are like, I don't need another class in my schedule. I am busy enough. I promise you, you will probably be busier later. And if you can make that later easier, you will probably thank me for it.
Yeah. Gosh, we have so much to say on this. I'm almost like we should split this up.
Yeah.
And add a bonus one. Stepping away from the classes that you'll take, there are other things that you can do now in undergrad and in college to help prepare you for your application and ultimately just your preparation for medical school. That's going to be the clinical experiences that you obtain and that you work on getting. And so a lot of times I'm still always a little surprised when students tell me this or they share this concern, because I'm like, why aren't we doing a better job at explaining this, in our undergrad experience? And it's that, let's say you have a specialty in mind. The clinical experiences that you obtain do not have to be tied to that specialty. Because guess what? Even if you tell medical school admissions officers during your interview, hey, I'm interested in neurology. Okay, great. But you might change your mind. And they know that so many students come into medical school and change their mind about what they want to do. And that is perfectly okay. There is nothing wrong with changing your mind in terms of what specialty. So if you only go in and only see neurology in your clinical experience, you're actually doing yourself a disadvantage because you're not seeing what else is out there, right? And so you're definitely going to have the opportunity to do a neurology rotation or, a longitudinal program in it when you get into medical school. So allow this to also be a time where you give yourself space to look at other things and what's out there and have those experiences, even if you are interested in one particular specialty. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't do a bunch of neurology, shadowing and clinical experience, et cetera. You absolutely can. Just make sure that you can speak on it. With the pandemic, a lot changed, and a lot of places for a long time did not allow students who were honestly sometimes in med school, that we had our limitations too about additional places that we could go to and whatnot for some time. But, a med student or students not in medical school, right, in college and undergrad, et cetera, didn't always have the same opportunities to shadow, to be involved in, hospital or clinical work as they did in the past. And so keep that in mind. And medical schools know this. So you can absolutely get creative with the clinical experiences that you do have. And maybe you are a scribe, maybe you were an EMT, maybe, you spent time with kids in the hospital that, just needed some extra time with people, or maybe you did COVID phone calls, right? Or contact tracing, and you were in contact with, physicians and helping do screening, things like that. Those are all different clinical experiences that you can have under your belt. And let's say you don't have a ton now, or you're just like, actually, I haven't stepped foot in a clinic because I didn't have access to all of those opportunities. As things, return to a new normal, whatever that may be in your area, take advantage of that and look for those opportunities now and find something that is both meaningful to you, but also has some clinical spin to it. And you'll be able to talk on that a lot better than just brute forcing your way miserable through your clinical experiences.
Yeah. And I want to be clear here, because a lot of times students ask about clinical experiences here. For me, just kind of includes anything clinical, including shadowing, including volunteering, including jobs, if you have that.
Mm-hmm.
Generally, we recommend students have about 250 hours by the time that they apply. Now that also can adapt and change. If you have some weak areas on your application, maybe this is much higher and this is just a strong area. Mm-hmm. Or let's say you only have 100 hours. Well, you better have some other things to ramp up for it. I know doctors, I know people who had fewer than 250. I know some that have more than that, but that's just kind of a general recommendation. Now, I do want to hammer, you do need some clinical experience. This is something that a med school's worst scenario, the worst scenario that they can run into is, I know we've talked about this before, but there are more qualified applicants than spots. Mm-hmm. What they don't want is somebody to go to med school, take up one of those spots, get in, 2 or 3 years and then leave because they said, this is not what I thought it was going to be. This is not what medicine is that I thought it was going to be. I say that as somebody who did that. Like, I am med school's worst scenario, right? Because my spot could have gone to somebody who will practice medicine. And I had a lot of clinical experience, so my scenario is a little bit different. But that's one of the ways that they can understand that you understand what medicine is. You understand what it means to be a physician. And so you need to have some clinical experience. It needs to not just be from like watching TV shows. If somebody like watches Grey's Anatomy and they think, oh, that's what it's going to be like. It's going to be super sexy and I'm going to have a Ferrari and right. And like everything will be awesome. When no, you'll actually be doing colonoscopies and like that is not that sexy. And so you need some experience. Now, whether that is, I think it's a good idea if you can get some shadowing with a physician. I think that that's great. It doesn't have to be 250 hours. If you only get 10 hours with one physician and maybe 10 hours with another, that's fine. But you need to make sure you are getting other clinical experience on top of that. Now, it could be all shadowing. And that's fine. I think that could work. It could be mostly a job. Like if you worked as an EMT for 4 years, you probably don't need a lot of clinical experience on top of that, right? And that's okay. So it could be volunteer, it could be paid, could be shadowing, could be whatever it is, but you need to have some. And there's a lot of students that push this off until they're like, oh crap, I'm applying to med school. Like in 2 months, I need to start getting clinical experience. And like that is later than you want. You want to get in before that. It also makes your application look better. Like med school admissions committees know when they can see like, oh, it's like you sent in your application in June. You started shadowing in May of this year. Like it seems like you're not actually interested in that and you're just doing it to pad your application. And if you want to go into medicine, you should be excited about getting some clinical experience. And so this isn't something, I think that this is not just something that you should do, but hopefully you want to do this. And it's exciting and interesting to you because this is when you will start to see patients. This is when you will start to understand what it means to be a physician. You'll start to learn some like about the job that you're going for. And that is super exciting and super interesting. And there's a lot of cool stuff that you can see and interact with in those times. Absolutely.
And what I'm going to say next, I want you to let me finish, to the people who are listening, don't freak out before I finish what I'm going to say. I've had so many conversations with classmates while we were in the hospital, in clinics, doing our rotations, et cetera. And our first, thought, or one of the first things that we said when we would meet up would be, this is nothing like what we thought medicine would be like. Like, this is truly nothing like what we thought it would be like. And this was not because, we were in a bubble. This was not because we only watched Grey's Anatomy. But if you go into a shadowing experience and you're just kind of like hanging around and you're not doing a whole lot, or maybe you only focus on one specialty, or maybe you are in and out, they're letting you watch surgeries, but you're just kind of in and out between different surgeries and you're not seeing what the downtime, what the bulk of the time looks like, you are missing out. And that was the case for most of us. It just truly was not what we thought it would be like. And so when you're deciding for your, what you're going to do for your clinical experiences, let's say that you are shadowing a physician, stay the whole time. Go with them into a patient room, out, see what they're doing between patients, take a look at what their notes look like, because you're going to spend a lot of time writing notes, a lot. Figure out what that looks like for them. Don't go home at the end of when the last patient leaves if they're still there. If you ask them, can I stay to see what it looks like? Because you want to have an idea of like fully what that can look like. And that's not to make people jaded. That's not to be like, oh my gosh, I didn't do that and now I'm screwed because now I'm not going to know what I'm getting myself into. It's not that. It's if you have the opportunity, take advantage of it so you can go into medical school having a better understanding of what medicine actually looks like.
That's a really good piece of advice. I haven't ever heard that specific piece of advice, but that's really good. A lot of physicians, if you ask them to shadow, will say something like, oh yeah, I have this really cool surgery that I'm doing like in 2 weeks. You should come to that one, right? And like go to that surgery. But I think if you explain to the person like, hey, can I just hang out with you all day, right? I want to understand what your day is like as a surgeon. So not just the exciting bits, but also the downtime, that sort of thing. And honestly, those surgeons, like if you were talking to a surgeon in this scenario, I feel like I would automatically start to respect that person a little bit more. Like, okay, you're trying to get like a really good idea. You're not just like want to see some cool thing, but you want to actually be able to like see and interact with all of this stuff. And I think that that makes me a little bit more excited to have you as somebody shadowing me if I was in that position. So that's a big deal.
Yeah. And recognize that not all physicians are going to take that the same way or be as comfortable with that. So my surgery preceptor is the kind of person that probably would let someone, hang out the entire day with her. I know other people that may not be as open to that, and that's okay. So if you have to kind of shop around, so to speak, and find someone who's willing to let you do that with them, then that's also okay.
That's also a big thing as well. I know a lot of times like a student will talk to like one doctor and the doctor will say no, but like realize doctors are all very different people. Like people are different people. And so like if you ask one person, they say no, and then you're like, oh, like I can't find a physician who wants like ask that doctor when they say no. It's like, oh, do you have an idea of some other physicians that I maybe should ask? Because they are going to know what sort of other physicians would be maybe more interested in that. And so I think that's how I would tackle that. Don't just accept no and then move on, but like no, say if they say no, be like, okay, do you have any idea of who I might be able to do this with? Because they'll be able to probably give you some good advice for them. On top of the clinical experience, I get a lot of students asking me about research experience. And I think that for this, there's a little bit more variance. I think that research experience is not quite as important as clinical experience on average, right? But I still recommend students, if you're looking for a number, like 250 hours for research experience also, but that varies a lot based on what do you want to do. And I know we talked about this at the very beginning, that like students should have an idea of what is it that they want to do. Do they want to do research? Do they want to do more kind of like patient focused, like community stuff? If you really want to do a lot of research and you want to go to a med school that does a lot of research, then you probably need more research on your application. If on the other hand, like if you want to like go to Mayo or Johns Hopkins or someplace, or even your state med school that has a big research facility, they're going to care more about research than like a DO school. Like there's one in Kirksville in Missouri. It's a DO school kind of in the middle of nowhere in Missouri that like they don't do a lot of research there. And so they're probably going to care more about like community side of things, community experiences. So these are things that there is some variation as well. I do think it's a good idea to get some idea of research experience, but I've seen more variation in this between med students than I have clinical experiences. I know some people who went to med school that had like no research experience. I know some people that have like a dozen published papers. And so this is something, there is some variation to this. I still think it's something that if you are trying to optimize your chances, you should be getting some research experience. Like that will make your application better. And so I do think you should be thinking about this. And also in general, that should probably be easier for you to get. If you are in undergrad, you're working with like you're taking classes with professors, ask your professors. Like, hey, do you have a lab? Can I work in your lab? Like, yeah, can I get some experience with this? I'm fine volunteering sometimes. And that is something that I would highly recommend. It's also nice. Ooh, that this like segues really well into the nice thing. It's like into the next thing of like using research as a way to develop relationships with your professors, because that may come in handy over the course of your application.
Yeah, Phil, it's letters of recommendation are required, right? Yeah. And so someone that you worked under, someone that you volunteered with or volunteered for can be an excellent source of a letter of recommendation, especially if they've gotten to know you with time.
Yeah. And so looking at like letters of recommendation, you need to really plan for this, and you should be looking at the schools that you want to apply to and seeing what they require. I know that there's a school I applied to that required a manager. someone who managed you to write a letter of recommendation. Another school required 2 professors. And so like depending on what schools want, like I might ask these 3 people for letters of recommendation, and that may work for these 7 schools, but not for these 3 other schools because these people don't hit those, right? Some schools may want a letter from someone you did research with. Some people may want a letter from a physician, right? That you have interacted with. And so this, like you may not have some of these things. These are some of the things you should be looking at beforehand, trying to figure out what schools you want to go to and having those people write letters and develop relationships with these people. Don't just like show up one day, like 2 years after like your freshman year and be like, hey, I took a class with you in my freshman year. I never talked to you. I never went to office hours. This is the first time, but I did really well in your class. Can you write me a letter of recommendation? Because that is not going to be a good letter. If I don't know somebody, how can I write a good letter to recommend them to become a physician? On top of this, also do whatever you can to help the people write the letter. So like come up with a list of things like, hey, this is all the information of ways that we've interacted. I worked in your lab for this many years. I worked on these projects. I was also in your class and I got this grade. And then I was also the supplemental instructor or TA for you. And so like, if you want to like only organize this and give it to you so that it's easier for you to write a letter, you might even bring up like, I'm trying to hammer in my primary application, my personal statement, that I am a hard worker. And I like, even though my grades were poor my freshman year, I've really kind of like come to love the academic world. And that is something that has changed. And so if anything you can write to kind of like reinforce that, if you feel comfortable, that would be great. And like that letter you're going to get is going to be so much better. I know I've talked about this a lot of times, but there was a med school I applied to, and they required a letter from professors. The 2 letters, both from professors. I have 2 people that I worked in their labs, and I asked both of them for a letter. One of those people talked about me working in the lab, but they didn't talk in the letter about me taking a class with them. They didn't talk about them being a professor of mine. And so that med school immediately rejected me, even though I was a student for this person. They didn't talk about it in the letter, so I was immediately rejected. And so be on the lookout for that. You don't want to be in those scenarios where, because the letter writer forgot to write something in the letter, you get rejected from med school. And so do whatever you can to make that easy for the letter writers to put in all the relevant information, make sure that they're putting in the stuff that the med schools are asking for, and make sure that you are asking for letters from people that fit those criteria. And different med schools have different criteria for those letters.
Yeah. So similar to, letters of rec, that's a little more granular and will depend on the medical school. There's also something else that will be constant throughout the medical schools, and that's going to be your personal statement.
Yeah. Your personal statement, you really want to hammer this. Make sure that you have a strategy for it. I know that we do free trial sessions talking about how to craft a personal statement. There's a lot of information in there, but you should be thinking about your personal statement. Like, I would say probably more than a semester before you're applying. Like if you want to apply in June at the end of your junior year, you should probably be thinking about that at like Thanksgiving of the year before. And don't just kind of phone in that personal statement. I know we've talked about personal statements a lot over the course of we've talked about it a couple of times over the course of the podcast. So you can always go back and listen to those specific ones, but you want to make sure that you are doing a good job kind of putting all of that stuff together.
Yeah, it's incredibly important because that's you, right? It's you on paper. And that's what medical schools want to see, because they want to see not just can you perform in academics, but who are you as a person? And that can feel really daunting. And so having the time to update it and change it and see, what experiences you want to put into it, et cetera, is incredibly important.
Yeah. That like kind of goes on like that's you on paper. A lot of the like the GPA stuff, the MCAT score stuff, all of that is really to just get your foot in the door where you're saying where med schools will say, okay, this person has hit all the criteria in order to they could be a medical student here. Now the question is, do we want this person compared to everyone else? This is where like personal statement, your secondary applications, your interviews, this is where all of these things come in, where if you're getting an interview, you're good enough to go to that med school. Like in terms of GPA and MCAT scores, like on paper, you are good enough. The question is are you somebody that they want representing that school? Is this like, if I have 500 people that are all good enough, but I've only got 100 spots, like who do I take? Right. And that's the scenario. And that's also something you should be thinking about, right? This is a big deal. And I think a lot of students kind of phone it in because they're just focused on numbers, right? GPA, MCAT, and like that sort of stuff. So you want to be thinking about this. Think about personal statement. Think about your secondaries. Think about your interviews. Prepare for these things. I know I've talked about this lots of times, but I'm a numbers guy. And so I care about numbers. Every year, only 40% of students who apply to med school get in. In our admissions department, we have people who will meet with you and help you figure out what to write for your personal statement. They'll do multiple edits of it for your secondaries. They'll help you work on your interview skills. The students that go through our admissions department, 94% of them get into med school, right? 40% in the general population, 94% of the people who go through admissions. And these are people who are spending extra time working on personal statement, working on interview skills, working on your secondaries, working on like how to write up your experiences, clinical experience and research experiences. And those things make a big difference. And a lot of students just kind of only think about MCAT, only think about GPA, and then just think based off of that, they're going to get in. And that is sadly not the world that we're in. Like you have to go that extra mile. To kind of explain to med schools, who are you as a person? And a lot of times students just go kind of vague with that. Like, I'm good and I work hard. And like, no, but that doesn't tell me who you are, right? Like, what do you care about? What are you interested in?
To be very clear, our admissions department is not the same people as the academic advisors.
Right.
So the academic advisors, the folks that you can reach out to for free, they are not going to sit down and read your personal statement for you or edit your personal statement for you. I want to be very clear on that. These are two very different groups.
Happened a couple of times in the past.
Yeah, exactly. They're there for an overarching idea of, what your MCAT plan but also application plan could be. But this is separate from our admissions department. We've definitely talked about this last one quite a bit on this podcast. And I think, Phil, it's because we had such intense experiences with it. And it's all about understanding and finding what a work-life balance can look like for you. And that was something that we both struggled with at the beginning of medical school. And things that if we had learned what that balance could look like before we got into medical school, while we were still in college, while we were still in undergrad, it would have made our life so much easier. And so learning to care for yourself holistically is so important. And one of the best pieces of advice, I got a couple of really good pieces of advice while I was applying to medical school when I first started. And one of them was have a list of things, and I may or may not have mentioned this before. You may have, tell me if I did, but have a list of things that are non-negotiables for you. Things that are rejuvenating and fill up your cup, because the last thing you want to do is pour out of an empty cup because you can't, or pour out of a cup with dirty water. We're not doing that here. Yeah. So making sure that, you have that non-negotiable list, and maybe you have something that's non-negotiable every week. Or if you don't have something that you do every week, maybe you pick something from that list every week and you use that to ground yourself. Or maybe something as simple as, I'm going to go for a walk, right? Every morning, whether or not I feel like it. And for you, that ends up becoming something that's really positive. And so understanding what that work-life balance can and should look like for you as an individual, which is different, which is why I'm not sitting here and telling you what it should look like, is important.
Yeah, I feel personally called out on this. I think I'm joking. I am still working on developing a good work-life balance. But you're right, Azaii, like getting up and going for a walk every single morning and scheduling time for that has made my life better. And I know I've talked about this, but as I like look back over the last month, I know I've talked about this with you, Azaii. I think I had 1 day off period for the last like 31 days. The thing is, so even though I like work weekends, I do set boundaries. I'm like, okay, on the weekend, I don't work after 10 o'clock, right? Like 10 o'clock, I'm like, get up, go for a walk, work for like, 4 hours, and then I'm done, right? Like I'm done, and I don't do anything after 10 o'clock because
10
that's
a.m.
time. Yeah, 10 a.m. because that's time for family and like interacting with friends and things like that. And so if I'm not going to say that my schedule is what everyone should go for, I should take some more days off. But like I've found a place that does somewhat work, that is sustainable and I think somewhat healthy. Like I can do this, and I can keep this up, but understanding kind of like balances overall. It also helps that the stuff that I'm doing is energizing to me, is something that I'm excited about, and I get amped up. I wake up in the morning and I'm like, I can't wait to go record this new video to help students better prepare for the MCAT. And I know that that's also why I think we talked about earlier, do stuff that you find interesting, because if you hate your work, it is really hard to have a good work-life balance, right? And so, if you really just don't like chemistry, but you read that a chemistry degree is one of the better degrees, that doesn't make sense. If you really love piano, go play piano, like do a performance piano degree. And like a lot of people will be interested to talk to you about it. And you'll have a better, healthier outlook on life. And you won't be kind of dreading every morning as you wake up, which is something that I think we've both been in those scenarios at different points in our life.
Yes.
And it's not healthy and it's not good. And so you do need to kind of understand how to keep this balance.
And also that balance is going to change, right? It's not going to be the same. And we never find a perfect place because we are human and things constantly change. And so it's just a matter of finding what in this moment will work and what in the future could work. And so with that, go ahead, make that list. Make a list of things that are important to you, and also make a list of what med schools you're interested in starting to be interested in.